morning, Detroit and surrounding areas. It's a pleasure to be back at WHPR. I am Leela McGee Harvey, a native of the city of Flint, coming to you to talk about what really happened in the city of Flint. Not his story or her story or their story, but our stories. We're going to spend the whole hour talking about what really happened in the city of Flint. So much happened, so many came in to write about our stories, to tell about our stories. Many was wordsmithed, redacted, there was alterations, but we're going to spend an hour talking about what happened. As a native, I was an activist in advocacy for the water crisis. I lifted my voice. I spent every Saturday empowering our community on radio about how to mitigate lead and Legionella through the body. I protested in Lansing. I went around the state fighting against the injustices, and I also survived the judicial system in our county. So we are going to spend all of today talking about what really happened in Flint. I was privileged about 2 years ago to meet with Ed Gordon from BET, and he told me, as one who was already lifting my voice, that I was responsible for making sure our stories were preserved. And I did just that. I spent about 18 months doing the research, and when I began to peel the onion back, you wouldn't believe what came from under that. And so I created a book, narrated what really happened in the city of Flint, called Underneath the Poisoning, Flint and Genesee County, Our Untold Stories. Before I go into that, I would like to introduce a person who came down with me from Flint, Miss Virginia Nolan. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Leela. Good morning, everyone. Flint and Detroit and the surrounding communities. I'm so blessed to be here today, and thanks, Ms. Leela, for inviting me.
Okay. And also, Ms. Nolan actually was an advocate. She created a lot of initiatives for blood work, making sure water drives, raising funds. Talk a little bit about that, Ms. Nolan, before we begin.
Yes. When the water crisis broke out, I was volunteering down at the city. I was volunteering at the front desk, and I was hearing the stories, the health challenges. It was all coming down there in Flint, and we began to seek out health, as you call it, health things to help people. And we started passing out at the city, and there were rashes, just children, adults. The seniors were left out at that time. And I began to work in the trenches with talking with people and hearing their stories.
Well, and I want to say, first of all, when I hold this up, this does look like a book. But I want Detroit to know that this is their story too. What I preserved was for the generations that we may never know. This is not a book. This is actually a journey, not only through the city of Flint, but through Detroit and every urban community in the state of Michigan. This is actually a journey through the state of Michigan. When I began to do the research, many of you probably remember me. Let me say that first. Many of you remember me from coming down with Richard Harrison and Dr. Will Coxon, covering the crisis when we were in the midst of the crisis. So many have asked about the city of Flint. So I want people to know, no, we are not in recovery.
Yes.
For me, recovery is not changing a pipe. Until the people are fully recovered, we are not in recovery.
Amen.
There has not been any medical for us. There have not been any cluster cancer studies for us. There are not insurances for us. Many of us are still dying on the ground. I know that the number was reported from the health department was 12.
Yes.
I believe Frontline came in and said it was 192.
Yes.
But you and I know, since 2016,
yes,
when they made that report, the numbers are about 400, 500 people. Mysterious deaths, young people. Let's talk about that a little bit right now.
Yeah, I want to talk about the stories again. I remember hearing the story of a young veteran who was in the hospital, local hospital in Flint. And when we would go out there and visit him, he would do better. I remember cups of water being given. And as soon as we get home, the nurse would call, he's taking a turn for the worse. Okay, then there's another story. a gentleman was telling me yesterday that his relative drank the water for years. Although she died old age, the water may have speeded up the death that came upon her.
And these are the stories that's taking place that right now, when we were in the midst of poisoning and the cameras were there, everybody came into our community. It was lights, camera, action. Everybody wanted to be in the front, but now the dust has settled. The monies, the funds have dried up.
Yes.
No one's coming in, but we insured, and I insured, to become a ghostwriter for the city of Flint. And I want to say to Detroit and all of the surrounding areas that the city of Flint sends their love as I move around the state and the country speaking about this journey. Again, this is not a book. This is a story. This was never about water for Flint, Michigan. It was never about water for Detroit, Michigan. This was about a three-tier heist, governmental heist, state, local, and city. This was about a heist that had been brewing for 60-something years. And when I began to do the research, only to do the research because I was locked out, my partner and I were locked out the judicial system as it related to our business, and this had been happening to African Americans for a very long time in Genesee County. I wanted to know who locked me out. I began to do the research, and we were in the midst of the water crisis. And I went through thousands and thousands and thousands of documents. And as I began to go through those documents, I was able to put the pieces, the whole entire puzzle together. So this was never about water. The water was the end result. This was about taking assets from urban communities, in particular where African Americans lived. I tell everybody, many of the cities that the emergency managers went into, those cities were like Michael Jackson. We were cash broke, but we were asset rich. I talk about the Shans in my work. This was about gentrification, regionalization, privatization. They finally got a governor who was really ready to work with privatization and regionalization. So this was about elitist people and stakeholders coming into urban communities and saying, now we want to come back and take the assets. I want to tell people what privilege is through my work. This piece of work is an actual interview that I did with a girl from Zimbabwe who now lives in LA. Her name is Eunice, but through the book I call her Celeste. And she came in, as many of the reporters did, and she says, Leila, I was told to come look for you. You have a lot of the information. You've been covering the crisis on the ground. And I told her only way I would sit down with her is if she heard our story. Because you've heard all of the documentaries, you've seen all of the individuals who've come into our city to write our stories. Our stories can't be told in 2 hours. They can't be told in 3 hours.
Exactly.
In order to talk about the crisis in the city of Flint, you have to talk about the past. And if you talk about the past, you have to talk about racism, because none of it will make sense. And this is why people would come in and they would say, well, I'm writing a documentary about the crisis in 2014. Our crisis didn't start in 2014. And the crisis in Detroit didn't start in 2014, nor in Pontiac. This was a convoluted scheme where you finally had a governor who put emergency managers in urban communities. And this governor's whole ideology was about profit-making ventures. It was about privatization. And this is why he created Public Act 4. Public Act 4 gave the emergency managers, his pick of emergency managers, the authority to dismantle and take all of the assets from urban communities. So when I talk about the crisis in Flint and the journey in Flint, this is a replica of Detroit and Chicago and all the other areas except the lead did leach in the city of Flint. You can find this right now. I would implore everyone to take this, not because I wrote it and I'm trying to say to you, I want you to purchase my book. I want you to purchase this book because this is a journal for your grandchildren's grandchildren. When you begin to go through this journey, I left 2 or 3 pages so that you can leave words inscribed for your children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren that we may never meet, because they always, the conqueror always writes our story and he wordsmithed. And even in the city of Flint, you and I can attest,
Yes.
they are now saying we were not poisoned, we were exposed.
Yes.
They are now saying the numbers was around 200 when we know the numbers were around 600. They are now saying that it was classism when we know it was racism. But I want to be careful about that word because classism did take place.
Yes.
And I think Dr. Mona Atish, Anna Clark, and Michael Moore, who wrote those journeys. And of course, they couldn't write about racism because you can't write about an experience you can't have. So I understood why they stayed away from it. When they talked about racism, they talked about racism based on the past.
Yes.
Well, my presence, my survival, my ability and my partner's ability to mitigate and push through the adversaries that were in our community and be locked out of a judicial system proves that it's going on in the 21st century.
Yes.
You can't cover me up, and there's not an offer or dirt. So we didn't allow them to cover us up. We are the end result. We are the residue. And as African Americans, you and I know we always find a way to rise. We always find a way to rise. So we're going to really break down, and we're going to spend our time talking about this interview, which is not a book. It is a journey.
Yes, it is.
Through the city of Flint, through Detroit, through Pontiac. This exposes by documentation. I tried my best to keep my opinion out of this book. By going through thousands and thousands of state and local documents, I was able to put together what really happened in the city of Flint, Detroit, and across the state of Michigan. I want to share something, and I don't know, as Detroiters, if most people are aware that the state of Michigan is the most segregated and racist state in America.
Yes. And in more ways than one.
And a lot of people don't know that. Through my work, I talk about a research firm. This research firm came in and said, based on housing patterns, social, civic, and employment, the state of Michigan in 2017 was more racist than the Jim Crow days in Mississippi. This is in 2017. Most people do not know that the city of Detroit is the most segregated and racist city in America.
Yes. Yes. I remember back some years ago talking about prescription drugs, just throwing this in there. And speaking of Michigan as being what it is, medicine is being described, and when it harms you, you cannot do anything about it. That was a law put in by one of the governors.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely. When I spoke about the journey through racism, because you and I know there's a contentious spirit, especially when I'm at home and I'm on over the radios. They kicked me because they like, Leela, stop talking about race. This was about classism. That was a journey if you were white and you were in the city of Flint. Yes, it was about classism. When I began to do the research, and I realized when the Senate put together the money, the Medicare that was supposed to come to the residents in the city of Flint for Medicaid relative to the poisoning, all around the surrounding areas of Genesee County where white people lived, they didn't have to work. For us to receive Medicaid, we had to work. When they decided to sign us up to the KWA, Lennon City, Lennon, Sanilac, Genesee County, and the city of Flint, who was compelled to take on this debt, all were signed up. They had to pay $32,000 to become a member that they would benefit for fracking. Poor African Americans and where impoverished whites were, we had to pay a whopping $300 million, and we didn't own the asset. So that's not classism. That's racism. That's not classism, that's racism. And many people don't want to talk about it, and that made it very difficult in Flint. If you and I know, when we were standing at the podium and we would stand next to many of the white people who marched along with us, we loved them. They lift their voice, and they too were poisoned. Through my work, I talk about when we were giving out water at New Jerusalem, and one of the white guys, he didn't know who I was. He didn't know I was covering the stories, and he began to narrate his version of what happened. And he took Daniel Early and threw him and Howard Croft under the bus and said, these were the orchestrators. I said, no, I was blessed by the divine to be in City Hall. I know the orchestrators of this plan was Jeff White, who was a white man, Mike Brown, who was a white man, and Ed Kurtz, who was a white man. And I said, if you're going to tell the truth, I know we always die first in the horror story, but it wasn't Donnell Early or Mike Brown. My work shows where they set Donnell Early up because he wanted to, as we always do, when the oppressed becomes the oppressor and we want to be a part of that, he was willing to sign on to the documents, even though they created and concocted the scheme.
Yes.
So I want to make clarity on that. So when I talk about classism versus racism, it's because I did the research.
Yes.
And in Flint, that kind of ruffles feathers a little bit, but I'm okay with it because I substantiate it by documentation.
Yes.
And so there were two journeys. One was about racism and one was about classism. And when I took the time to do the research, because I just really wanted to know who locked me out of the judicial system, when I did the research and began to go all the way back, I had no idea that the city of Flint at that time was the third, when we began to migrate here, was the third most segregated city in America.
Yes.
And it made sense why we pushed forward for through the housing, created the housing, 1968 Housing
Yes.
Act. It made sense why we became the first for the community schools, because Charles Stewart Mott didn't believe that African Americans and whites should integrate nor go to schools together. That's why he created community schools.
Wow.
And the whole nation mimicked that policy.
Yes.
And most people are not aware of that. So I know I'm giving you a lot of information, but we're going to really break this journey down, and we're going to come back
Yes.
next week. But anybody that wants to call in, give us a call
Sure.
in at 313-868-0342. Again, please feel free to give us a call at 313-868-0342. Okay?
Yes.
Right. I want to talk a little bit, Miss Virginia, as it relates to when the crisis first took off and when the emergency managers came in and created Public Act 4. Let's
Yes.
talk about that.
Okay.
Let's talk about how when he came in and created, which I called through my work and I did the interview, a lethal weapon.
Yes.
That was a legal lethal weapon.
Yes.
And I talk about him using that weapon to come into urban communities to gut them out. Now, I can't speak for the city of Detroit. I can't even speak for Pontiac, but what I can tell you based on facts, that when he came into the city hall, it was not just the governor himself. There were local officials, our local stakeholders, who have always believed in regionalization, polarization, marginalization, gentrification. These individuals worked hand in hand and they lobbied at the state level because Governor Snyder didn't kick our back door in. There were people who were willing. And I used to become angered, if you know,
Yes.
and I stood up at many of
Yes,
the meetings.
you did.
When we would go to the podium and just ramp about Governor Snyder, how can you see what he's done and not the local stakeholders?
Yes.
And I understand many in our community were being fed by them, so they didn't want to make them complicit at that time.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
you know. So that bothered me a whole lot as it related to us going through this. But Public Act 4, the creation of Public Act 4, now I'm getting ready to go into Detroit just a little bit. Coleman Young, rest his soul, created more millionaires than any other city, African American millionaires. And Coleman Young had something that no one in the state of Michigan had. He had a water source. He had the 4 elements, which was source, distribution, treatment, and he had the pipeline. So in Flint, we didn't have a pipeline. We could clean the water, we could distribute the water, we could even treat the water, but we didn't have a pipe going into a water source. Detroit had that.
Yeah.
So when Governor Snyder became the governor, if you go into his records for those who contribute to his campaign, most of those lobbyists were into fracking.
Yeah.
So on the west side of the state of Michigan, I want to break down what really happened in our community.
Yes.
On the west side of the state of Michigan, they did not have that pipeline that Detroit had. What they wanted, they needed to run a pipeline on the west side because they already had one on this side. But what they also needed, they wanted control of that pipeline. So when they created Public Act 4, they came in and sent to the emergency managers, you will see the time Kilpatrick was there and the time Mayor Kilpatrick of Detroit as mayor and Mayor Walling of Flint was there. Water did not increase drastically. It was not until the emergency managers came into Detroit and the city of Flint, they began to gouge and send water rates extremely high because they had a plan. So their plan was they would influx it so high and they would say, hey, we have to do something about water because we can't control it. If you look at the numbers through my book, you will see that the numbers did not change drastically between Kilpatrick being the mayor and our mayor Walling. Once the emergency managers, Mike Brown, and I believe was Orr was the first, you can see it influx. The reason they did that was they had to cut Detroit's largest customer from them. Who was the largest customer? Flint. So they severed the tie between Flint and Detroit so that they can go to Detroit's bankruptcy and say, hey, Flint came off of this, and we can't afford to pay these bills. What they wanted was Detroit's water source. And so now it sits under the Gleeville Water Authority, the water authority from the state of Michigan. Even though I believe they pay Detroit only $50 million a year to maintain it, they didn't want to do the work, but they want to do the collection. Detroit lost many jobs, but the state, when they regionalized the water authority, they gained 500. So when it came to Flint, our local stakeholders this is a 3-tier heist. And it went bad, and I wouldn't be sitting on your show had not the lead leached. And for the longest, I always talked about how the divine allowed the lead to leach. And people said, Leila's crazy for saying that. Why would you say God did that? Because if the lead had not leached, you and I know we would both be dead from Legionella. Because the governor would not take us off the water because it was brown. He only took it off because lead was in there.
It had to leach.
Had to leach.
Had to
leach. Because they were 3/4 around the track when the divine allowed the lead to leach, and all of this began to be exposed. So I'm going to go back just a little bit because I want Detroit to understand what was really taking place here. And so they gouged the water. They create Public Act 4 to break every contract, to send every city, because before then they didn't have, emergency managers didn't have that kind of power under 101 and 72. Okay, didn't have that kind of power. This man was so enraged, and he was so adamant, the governor was, about ensuring that they break this tie. You remember when we repealed Public Act 4, almost 800,000 people across the state of Michigan repealed it. He went back and created a new one, Public Act 436, but this time he put it into legislation so you couldn't repeal it. They were determined to make sure that they got access to that water line because that is revenue. So they took the jobs from Detroit, created 500 new jobs under the Gleeville deal, and sent Detroit over to bankruptcy. When an emergency manager's job is to be skilled about economics, his job is to be skilled. He is to look at assets and say, how can we create employment? How can we create businesses that will sustain? Because Detroit had a lot of assets just like Flint. But that was not what they came in for. As a matter of fact, I'm going to go back. When I talked about the west side of the state of Michigan for fracking. So all of those people that didn't understand what Kerry Gandhi meant, that's what Kerry Gandhi was. The new water pipeline for the West, because Sanilac, Lennon, Davison, and all of his people on the left side of the state were in need of a new pipeline. And if you remember, when Ed Kurtz came, he says that pipeline has to be 55 inches or more because they needed that high power force to come through that side of the state.
Leila, you have done your research with accuracy.
You know,
and I applaud you for that.
Thank you. It was really because I'm not going to say, you know, I covered the story. I protested the injustices, but I didn't cover the story because I wanted to be a writer. It really was. I wanted to find out who was locking my partner and I out of the judicial system. And when I began to do the investigation, it never stopped. The onion just kept going back, and I was able to take thousands and thousands of documents and put them together And that's when Celeste came in, and I said, Celeste, those are not our stories.
Yes.
And I will give you the story, but not in 2 hours. So she and I agreed, and it was 5-day interview, and I took that and turned it into book form.
Yes.
So that these stories
Remarkable.
preserved.
Yes.
Because I didn't want people to believe that this was a happenstance, and some people believe just, oh, the lead leaks. We haven't even gotten into that portion. I just wanted Detroit to understand how prodigious this plan was.
Yes.
And how strategic it was.
And what's interesting about it is the people, they do not, I don't think they understand what is happening.
They didn't understand it because
Yeah.
we have been conditioned to trust
Yes,
government.
yes.
You know what I'm saying? And I
Yes.
get it because I did too. We've
I
been
did too.
conditioned to trust government, and government would never do this to you.
Yeah.
But you have to understand, we were poisoned by the state, DHS, the local officials, and everybody. And the crime wasn't that they poisoned us; it was the cover-up.
Yes.
But I don't want to deviate before I finish with
Okay.
Detroit. So I just want to say, so when we had so you take the water authority from Detroit
Yes.
and regionalize it under the state, because then what happens is you can send Detroit into bankruptcy, and you can begin to break her up so she can be gentrified more. You go over to the west side, where we are with the GLEWA deal, the KWA deal, Cariganda Water Authority. That's what it was formed. So when you hear KWA, that's that new pipeline that went along the west. And they looked around and said, who can we get to pay for this? Because the city of Flint and Detroit was, like I said, asset rich. Cash broke, but asset
Assets.
rich.
Yeah.
So emergency manager, man, I mean, I know I could have came in there and did some wonders in the city of Flint and Detroit
Yes,
with the
yes.
assets that they had.
Yes.
But what they were doing is they were gentrifying the place and regionalizing it at the same time. Because not only did they leave us with assets, we had something else that stakeholders in the state of Michigan didn't like, which was voting power.
Yes.
And all of a sudden, you can see since 2010 in Detroit and Flint, it's being gentrified. It's being gentrified. And some people say, oh, Leland's great. I'm going to tell you what privilege is, if you're out there listening. Privilege is when we moved here, migrated here to work in the shops.
Yes.
In Detroit and Flint and Pontiac and all these other areas, they flooded to all the suburbs.
Yes.
And when they went to the suburbs, they said, you know what? We're going to build a Silver Dome by us. We're going to build the Pistons, the Auburn Hills, because we don't want to drive. We want it right here.
Amen.
Let me tell you what privilege is. But when they began to gentrify, they abandoned two big edifices. Nothing was wrong with the Silver Dome. Nothing was wrong with the Auburn Hills, the Palace. They like convenience, so they say, let's put it back downtown. So when they began to come back into Detroit to develop, they brought the Palace back. They brought Ford Field back. This is called privilege. So we
Yeah.
have to really pay attention to what they're doing. You get me? There was
Yes,
nothing
yes.
wrong with the Silver Dome, except I don't want to drive 30 minutes now because I want to move back to Detroit. I have my lofts there, my stores, my farmer stores, my organic stores are there. I want to be able to walk out and I can do everything right where I'm at now.
Yes.
And you begin to disperse the people. So when I talked about, I'm going to go back, when I talked about initially the water, and I talked about under the emergency manager in Detroit, under the emergency manager in Flint, influxing the water till you can't afford it. Who does that hurt? It
The
hurts
people.
the residents who are
Yes.
there living in
Yes.
poverty.
Yes.
So what do they have to do? They have to find a new area where they can afford water. That's the science to gentrification. So I always tell people, because people like to use the word gentrification and they throw it around. Gentrification is the process of taking a community or a home and making it middle class. It is the process of taking a community or a home and making it middle class. And that's a good thing. But how do you get the people who've been living there for 100 years to become middle class if you do not have a strategic and urban agenda for them?
Yes.
You increase debt. You increase their liabilities. And they will move. You shut down stores. Malcolm told us you shut down department stores. You close schools. You raise, and they will flee the area. And it's being gentrified now. So when Governor Snyder came in, he came in for two reasons. He wanted that pipeline out of Detroit to send Detroit into bankruptcy because this was about regionalization, gentrification, and privatization.
Yes.
I said all the shuns. In the city of Flint,
Yes.
they were at work with the pipeline with the KWA.
Yes.
But in the city of Flint, it was a little more perplexing because they had to build it. They just took
Yes.
it from Detroit. They had to build one. And they looked around and said, who can we get to pay for this? I know some African Americans who they won't think. Nobody, this NAACP doesn't support them anymore. The pastors
Yes.
are not going to stand up. They're going to be on their own. We can go in and we can nullify the mayor with the emergency managers and take all their power, the mayor and council,
Yes.
and make sure they don't have any voting power.
Yes.
And we can go in and sign them up to a bond, an ACO order,
Yes.
and compel them to pay, even though they were in emergency for debt. We're going to give them a $300 million debt, even though they can't handle $1 million debt.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to make them pay for a pipeline.
Yes.
They won't own it. We're going to own it. And so Sanilac and Lennon and Genesee County all makes money off of it, except for those who had to pay for it. That is not a journey through classism.
Yes.
That's a journey through racism. And I get people say, oh, Leela, no. We live here too. I remind you in the 80s and the 90s, 80s it was about 80% African American.
Yes.
It began to decline maybe around 70-something. We began
Yeah.
to move because of the gentrification and the deterioration of our community. And it was being starved out economically. And around we got to 2000, about 2007, we had the housing collapse all across the country. So there was a lot of white families who lost their homes, those big, beautiful homes. So they came back to the urban communities where their parents owned a home. And they are now living there. So that's how you got the influx of whites back into urban communities. Why would a white person come into a community that was declining? They don't come because, and so then all of a sudden you're riding down a bus stop, you're like, I ain't never seen so many white families at the bus station.
Yes.
They had no choice.
Yes.
So, yes, they were poisoned, as I told the guy here when we were lifting water and we began to argue back and forth. And he says, you act like I have, he starts showing me all these sores and skin. And I said, I get it, because we have those too.
Yes.
I'm just saying it's that much harder when your skin is melanated.
Yes. Yes.
It's that much harder.
And while we're busy being distracted, and we're distracted by everyday living, taking care of our children, working, there's other things that has to be, it's a must that we pay attention to. And I'm glad you're talking about it, and the understanding is going forth. I want us all to pay attention and be aware.
Absolutely.
Yes.
You can purchase this under, and again, this is not a book. This is a journey through Flint, Pontiac, Detroit, the state of Michigan. This is our stories preserved 3-4 years for generations that we will never know. These are our stories, so that our stories cannot be wordsmithed, so that they can't redact, they can't change and alter what happened to us, 1.8 million African Americans in the state of Michigan. It can never happen.
Yes.
And we certainly do, as I always say, we certainly do have regard for anybody that it hurt. But I do not want to confuse people and misconstrue that this was not based on racism.
Yes.
And also, you can get this under Lespressions, www.lespressions, LESPRESSIONS.com. You can find me under Amazon,
Yes.
Leela McGee Harvey, underneath The Poisoning, Flint and Genesee County, Our Untold Stories, Barnes & Nobles, Smashwords, or you can call me personally at 810-787-3668. And if you have a question, you can call in onto the show at 313-868-0342. Again, that's 313-868-0342. And so I just kind of wanted to bring everybody together as to what was really taking place, because people were confused. And I say what happens a lot of times is the stakeholders set so many brush fires that we become what we call symptom-centered.
Yeah.
And we're running to every brush
Yes.
fire, and we don't know what's going on, and we're all
Exactly.
confused. Well, I took the time, and I was still,
Yes.
as the divine has required of all of us.
That's right.
I was still, and I put on the spirit of Harriet Tubman, and I put on the spirit of Fannie Lou, and all of them, and said, it is my obligation
Yes.
to ensure and do my part, which was to stand against the injustice in the Justice Department in our county, and they didn't think we would survive the 8 years, but I
Yes.
am here.
Yes.
And to also preserve our stories so that nobody can say what happened to us in the state of Michigan.
It is a blessing.
Most people do not know the state of Michigan is comprised of 1.8 million African Americans. Of the 83 counties or townships that exist, we only comprise 11 of them. He came into 5 of them, including the public school,
Yes.
because they were asset rich. When the emergency managers were sent into state of Michigan, into Pontiac and Detroit, there were 133 white communities that were doing as worse as we were.
Yes.
And he did not send them in. Now, he did send it into Allen. I want to say Allen. And one of the reasons why was not because the books were all messed up, but this was a reverse psychology for racism, so we can't holler
Yes.
racism.
Yes.
But even then, the mayor made some bad business decisions on some land, and they couldn't pay the note. So we're not talking apples to apples. All through the work, whether I was in the state of Michigan doing the research, or whether I was in Detroit, or whether I was in Flint, one of the things I've realized, and it was in common, the stakeholders and the governor never hurt white people. They never wanted to hurt white people, whether they were poor or whether they were rich. It was always, wherever African Americans were saturated, the worst deals were created in that particular. And if whites happened to be living there, they became a part of that.
Yes. Well, you do protect your own, which is something that we must migrate towards. We've gotten away from how our ancestors lived.
Oh, absolutely, especially in Flint. We haven't even gotten into that, but we're going to do some of that segment
Okay.
next week.
Okay.
But that, you're absolutely right. I wanted the state of Michigan, and I wanted all the listeners and the viewers to understand how prodigious this heist was. This was methodical. They had set, and this didn't happen when he became governor. You have to understand, when Public Act 4 was created and it was implemented in March of 2016 when he took office.
Yes.
When you think about, I'm sorry, 2011. When you think about March of 2011, when you think about him becoming, I'm sorry, I'm wrong, March of 2012.
Okay.
When you think about Governor Snyder, in 3 months he had a Public Act 4. This thing was so prodigious and meticulous, and the detail. There was no way you had an opportunity from January to March to assess all of these communities and to say what it needed and create a public act unless you had been doing that, you were creating that before you became governor. There's no way possible
Yes.
for you to go in and be able to assess that these communities are going to need a emergency manager in 2 months. You had Public Act 4 2 months after you entered office. That means you assessed all of these places. This is the research I did. You assessed all these places in 2 months and was able to create a public act that would be the resolution for these places.
So how far back did the plan go?
That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So they're always in the back room planning, and we're always on the menu.
Yes.
So this was a 3-tier heist that had been brewing for many years. They finally got a governor to acquiesce to them. The city of Flint is a little different than Detroit, because when I did the research about emergency managers, and I went all the way back, Flint is the only one that recycles the same emergency managers. Every other place has new emergency managers.
Yes.
And as a matter of fact, through this work, when I began to do the research on the emergency managers, I realized that our emergency managers never had experience in finance.
Yes.
They never had the experience in finance. So this was kind of weird for me, and I began to, and as a matter of fact, with one emergency manager, I can't even find secondary education on him.
Wow.
It does not exist. When I went to Ed Kurtz, I could be wrong, could not find secondary education on Ed Kurtz. So when you think about assets and you go in and you think about all of the assets that both communities had, Pontiac and Detroit and the city, you didn't come in to balance. You came in to take, because there was enough assets for you to create enough revenue to sustain it. But you didn't want it sustained with the majority of the people owning it.
Yes.
Because the majority of the people own what's there by vote, by tax dollars. And so that's what's going on. Again, you can find this under Barnes and Noble, Amazon, Leela McGee Harvey. Under my website, Lespressions, I do have a trailer, which is really powerful. www.lespressions, LESPRESSIONS.com. If you want to know what happened, not his story or her story or their story, bless their hearts, all of them coming in, but our stories about the state of Michigan and all of the areas, this is the interview. This is the truth about it. I'm going to go back to say, I don't know, because I didn't do the thorough research as it related to Detroit and Pontiac's municipality.
Yes.
But in the city of Flint, based on my research and based on the end result, if Karen Weaver had not become mayor, there would be boards on City Hall today. City Hall was being shut down and we were being regionalized. I go back to 2016 in M Life paper, many of us didn't pay attention to, but I have it in here, where the county designed a metroplex. They designed a metroplex, and in that metroplex they said, we want Flint to come over, but this was after they had taken all of our assets. So you don't design a metroplex unless you have a reason to shut something down.
Yes.
And if you remember, towards the latter part of 2015-16, Mayor Walling, former Mayor Walling, came out and said, the county of Genesee have now balanced their books. They didn't balance it off the KWA because it had not been created yet. They balanced because they took our golf course, they took our 911, they took our 911, they took our, not our pension, but, I can't think of the name of it. At least 15 assets.
Yes.
And moved them over to the county. So the county now began to get administrative fees, and all of these assets now sit under the county.
Yes.
This was a hijacking. It was a heist. This was a heist. So Detroit, they sent them in a bankruptcy so they could reorganize and control the power. Flint, they were shutting the doors, except the lead leached in the water. Except the lead leached in the water. So I tell everybody, this was never about lead. Lead actually, and the deaths actually suppressed what really went on. So through my trailer, I tell people, and I say in my trailer, would he, she, or they had come in to talk about the heist had not the lead leached? No.
Yes.
No one has ever lined up to talk about racism when it comes to African Americans. And that's why I have taken this journey, and I'm starting a national campaign to make Flint be the first to force a candid conversation about race. Because in here, I talk about my journey and my partner's journey. And I tell America, racism is so prodigious, there's nothing you can do with it. But it can expect for me to wake up every morning and greet it.
Yes.
I'm not going to stand down.
Yes.
I'm going to greet it, and I'm going to stand against it with everything that I have in my body. And when I'm finished with it, I'm going to go home and I'm going to skip rocks, and I'm going to meditate, and I'm going to have a great day, and it can expect me the next day to stand up, because when we do not oppose injustices, we become a part of
it. Yes.
We become a part of that.
Yes.
And I don't think Detroit and Pontiac and any of the surrounding areas are any different than Flint. We went through, in my work I talk about it, all of this is fact. When the oppressed becomes the oppressor, and every time there was, my partner and I was passed around for 8 years from the five most powerful white men in the county. And every time there was a bounty on us or we were cut off, there was always one of us willing to take us there.
Yes.
Always setting us up So I talk about African Americans because we like to talk about racism.
Yes.
But we don't want to deal with implicit biases. We don't want to deal with we so fractured. I talk about the pressure cooker in my work.
Yes.
Where as African Americans, we're all put into a pressure cooker.
Yes.
And it becomes so intense. Some of us come out and we're rebellious. We're so radical, there's nothing
Yes.
we can do with you. You're not serviceable anymore.
Yes.
Some of us come out and the pressure is so intense that we break and acquiesce, and whatever the master tell us, that's what we gonna do.
Yes.
And some of us come out and say, I'm going to stand against it. And I'm going to find my balance.
Yes, that's why it's so important that we take care of ourselves and we meditate and we think on these things.
Absolutely. And so I give that analogy to say that we can't just talk about racism from white people. We have to talk about and have that candid conversation across the nation when the oppressed becomes the oppressor, and when we're willing to line up to hurt our own for self-preservation and for self-gratitude.
Yes.
So we have to find a way. And I know it's difficult because what my partner and I endured, most people couldn't even fathom in their mind. But I knew who was with me along the way.
Yes.
And I'm not saying it wasn't difficult.
Yes.
I'm just saying I knew who was with me. And I studied the history of those who have come before me. And I said, if they could make it, I can make
Can
it.
too.
And my partner felt the same very way. And so you can't have gone through this that I've went through and not leave it as a footprint for the generations I mean, it is my duty to make sure they never have to endure and that they can learn from everything that we've went through across the state of Michigan.
Yes.
It is so important.
Yes.
It's very, very important. And so I kind of wanted to talk about those things because when we come back next Thursday, I want to really tear into the gut of racism. I want to talk about the poisoning.
Yes.
And I want to talk about the implicit biases. I want to talk about when the oppressed becomes the oppressor, the taboo conversation we just don't like to have because nobody wants. And Uncle Tom wasn't a bad person. I don't know where that came from, but he was not a sellout. So I'm not going to even say Uncle Tom anymore. But I'm going to say the coon, whoever he was. But Uncle Tom, I said, who came up with, I studied Uncle Tom. I said, he wasn't a sellout. I don't know where that came from. And I used to go around, oh, yo, Uncle Tom. I'm like, I don't say that anymore. Yeah, but it is for us to do that, to lift our voice, to move around. And this, again, is not a book. I have gotten so many reviews from whites, Hispanics, African Americans. This is a must-read for every American because I tear racism open, but not from the end of just what white people do, what we do to one another. Now what? Now what? We lived it. It is proof that it goes on in the 21st century. They talk about the past and, oh, let's just leave the past in the past. I talk about that through my work. You cannot leave the past in the past if the policies are the same.
Yes.
The only thing has changed are the characters. And I show that all through here. I show who Charles Stewart Mott was. Everybody thinks, yay, Charles Stewart Mott. He was a segregationist. He was a brilliant man who had a flaw. He did not care for black people. And that is the largest foundation now who feeds us, but they're under the same philosophy and premise. A foundation or an organization is created on the premise of the founder, its ideology.
Yes.
And he leaves in place a charter for you to equity. And this is why Mott has never put money on the northern end, because that's in part of that charter. You think about it, he can only develop downtown. Ruth Mott was the fourth wife. Most people don't know that.
Fourth.
That was the fourth wife who had a different ideology, and she wanted to help all people. So that's why you see Ruth Mott on the northern ends and eastern ends of Flint, and Mott just stays downtown.
Interesting.
Most people don't know that.
Yes.
Yeah, but it's what we don't know, and so we're going to be here to talk about that. I enjoyed being here. Detroit and the surrounding areas and Flint.
Yes.
Know that as I sit here The city and the residents of Flint send their love because it was ordinary residents. I will tell you, it was ordinary residents who stood in the cold. It was ordinary residents
Yes.
who fought against Governor Snyder. It wasn't all these people you seeing in these pictures and all these people that they take pictures of. It was people who are voiceless. I made sure
Yes.
that they would be bronze forever. Those were the individuals that broke the stories.
Yes.
Those were the individuals who now still don't push back.
Yes.
Those were the individuals who never stopped laboring despite what, and you know, we had a media blackout. And they're doing a media blackout on me now because no one wants to talk about the truth. When the lead first leaked, remember there was a local media blackout because the stakeholders influenced our papers. Remember, we had to
Yes.
fight until we got,
Yes.
they came in nationally, they wouldn't cover our stories.
Yes.
Yeah, they
Yes.
wouldn't cover our stories. So this is very promising for me to be able to share what happened in Flint with
Yes.
Detroit, Pontiac, and all the other areas. We're going to come back next week and we're going to really digest
Yes.
this and tear this book open.
Yes.
But as I say, and I'm going to leave a call, I always try and come across the airways to enlighten. Give us a call. I don't know, did we have a call on that line? Is that, I think you hit
Yes.
this button. Oh, we're probably out of time. Go ahead and hit that. Is that a caller? I don't know if that was a caller or not. I think it might have been. They might have hung up.
No, they hung up.
Okay, I'm sorry. We didn't even see it. We were just talking. And so coming across the airwaves to enlighten and to ensure that this is never repeated, but to leave our stories and preserve our stories.
Yes.
And that's what we're going to do. We're going to go, and we got to have that candid conversation
Yes.
about race with white people, but also about implicit biases
Yes.
and about the oppressed becoming the oppressor. We have to have those conversations if we're going to make better our community.
Yes.
And so it was a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
It was a pleasure having you,
Yes.
Ms.
Thank
Nolan.
you. I enjoyed it.
Please
Thanks
pick
so much.
this journey up. It is a journey underneath the poisoning, Flint and Genesee County, our untold stories. You will love it. I break down everything that happened, and the best way to ever tell history is in story form because it's never boring.
Yes.
And I'm getting great reviews about it.
Yes,
but
you
this
are.
is our truth.
Yes,
this
it
our
is.
truth.
Our voice.
This is our voice.
Yes.
It absolutely is. We thank you for joining us, and I can be reached at 810-787-3668. Thank you for listening, and as I say in Flint across the airways, I love you, and there is absolutely nothing you can do about it. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.